Welcome all. We are thrilled to have you here for our course preview of Wuthering Heights, being taught by a wonderful instructor at the Graham School who also doubles as an outstanding staff member, Trish Bredar. And on a morning like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm Seth Green. I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago. Welcome to our campus, which is every bit this sunny and beautiful today. And welcome to the Graham School. I see a lot of friends in the audience, but if you don't know who we are 134 years young in the lifelong learning movement. We have been blazing new paths for individuals across all ages and stages of life to engage with the intellectual universe here at the university, whether they want to read great literature, as we'll be talking about today, or discern new life paths. And I'll just mention we have lots of other exciting events coming up. Next week, we will have an info session on our basic program, which amazingly, considering we are in May, is already filling up for next year. We have over 60 already in our 4-year program starting in the autumn. And so we're thrilled to see that program continue to thrive and invite you to join us to learn more. We have an exciting conversation the next day on a new book from Brandeis's Mark G. Lackman on a new vision for midlife. And then at the end of next week, we will have a First Friday lecture, very consistent with our America at 250 theme, looking at the Charter of Democracy, Lincoln the Declaration, and the role of statesmanship. But the reason you are here today is to hear from my wonderful colleague, Trish. So I'm going to take my screen down here so that we can see Trish. And let me make an introduction because many of you know she's the assistant director of non-credit programs at the Graham School. But prior to joining Graham, Trish directed the public humanities programs at Northwestern University's Kaplan Humanities Institute. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Notre Dame with a specialization in 19th century British and related literature. So certainly an expert on the class she is about to teach, and that we'll talk about today. During her time at Notre Dame, she obtained 2 teaching certificates through the Kahneman Center for Teaching and Learning and received the Outstanding Instructor Award in 2021. She has inspired students in many different contexts. She's taught literature courses in traditional classrooms from the University of Colorado to Notre Dame to Northwestern. But she has also led experiential learning courses in London, such as Walking Literature in London and Literary Seance, Communing with Victorian Lives, Texts, and Objects. And she has taught college-level humanities courses in prison through the Northwestern Prison Education Program and the Moreau College Initiative. She's also published a handful of scholarly articles on 19th century women's writing. And we are so thrilled at her being just such an outstanding colleague and her being such a big part of our universe. And we're thrilled for this new role for you here at Graham, even though it is not an all new for you, given that you've already been an award-winning instructor. So let me, jump in with the obvious first question. We knew we wanted you to teach, Trish, but why did you decide to teach this course on Wuthering Heights?
Yeah, thank you, Seth. And just also thank you for having this conversation with me today. It's a real pleasure to speak to you ahead of my first class at the Graham School. And, having had the privilege of working with our students and instructors in a kind of administrative capacity for the past few months and seeing what an amazing community this is, has really magnified my excitement about teaching this course, which I would have already been excited to teach. So thank you. Uh, Gosh, why this course? So I'll start with my kind of academic interest in Wuthering Heights and why I think it's such a great text to teach. So as I'm sure some of you all know, the Bronte sisters, Emily, Anne, and Charlotte were, I think, some of the most fascinating literary figures of the 19th century. So writing in the 1840s, Wuthering Heights was published in 1847. And there's a real richness and unique quality to their work that I attribute in part to just the concentration of literary creativity in a single household, and growing up in a relatively isolated fashion on the moors of West Yorkshire, which we can talk about more in a bit. To some extent, their isolation from society has been a little bit overblown. I think we have a very romantic notion. But Emily in particular really was deeply attached to her home and to these imaginary worlds that she created with her siblings. So they had these really ornate, basically worlds that they created as children and continued to kind of imaginatively inhabit and write about into their adulthood. And so I think this imaginative power is really uniquely captured in Wuthering Heights, which both kind of immerses us in this very specific landscape through these vivid descriptions of nature and the region, but which also gives us something like almost otherworldly in its account of human passions and what love and resentment and healing can look like in this kind of pressure cooker of an environment that Bronte creates. And then, of course, the fact that this is the only novel that Emily Bronte produced. She died at the age of 30 of tuberculosis shortly after this novel was published. And so, I mean, it's a literary tragedy, but it also adds a fascination that this is sort of the one major literary work that we have from Emily. And so those are the reasons that I was sort of most excited to teach this text. I will say the kind of why now question does have a little bit to do with the recent film adaptation, which is called Wuthering Heights in quotations. And if you if you take the class, we can talk more about that. But I thought that this kind of controversial adaptation has sparked a lot of discussion and interest in the novel, and hopefully brought some new readers to it as well. Although they might be surprised at what they find in the novel and how much it differs from what's on screen. But I think it's really interesting in the classroom to kind of bridge this gulf between the general perception of Wuthering Heights as this like fiery, passionate romance and the reality of the text, which is much more complex, much darker, but also I would argue a bit more hopeful than what most of the film adaptations give us. So those are sort of the two halves of why I think this is the right moment for a Wuthering Heights class.
Well, that is fascinating. Although I'm shocked to hear Hollywood would create a movie that isn't a perfect representation of the original
I
book.
know. What can you
Uh,
do?
so can we jump into the book itself? And one thing that is striking is the setting. You mentioned the
Mhm.
moors. It's kind of iconic in nature, and this idea of nature almost versus society. Can you talk about those themes that run through the book and that kind of set the context for so much then of the inner story?
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of in faithful fashion to my teaching approach, I want to actually look at a little bit of the text.
Great.
Marina, if you I think you have a quote to put on screen here. Beautiful. And I will say this can't be a real discussion because it's a here we are on Zoom. But I welcome reactions in the comments as well as we go through some of these passages. So this is from the first chapter. There won't be any spoilers. Yeah, no spoilers in today's talk. So this is kind of our first description of Wuthering Heights, which is, as you see here, a house. So Wuthering Heights is the name of Mr. Heathcliff's dwelling. Wuthering being a significant provincial adjective, descriptive of the atmospheric tumult of which its station is exposed in stormy weather. Pure bracing ventilation they must have up there at all times, indeed. One may guess the power of the north wind blowing over the edge by the excessive slant of a few stunted firs at the edge of the house, and by a range of gaunt thorns all stretching their limbs one way, as if craving alms of the sun. Happily, the architect had foresight to build it strong. The narrow windows are deeply set in the wall, and the corners defended with large jutting stones. So this again is sort of shows the namesake of the novel. Um, and again, there's no spoilers here, but the novel will take its time in showing how Heathcliff becomes the possessor of Wuthering Heights. And we can return to maybe his introduction into the novel later. Um, but we see here that the novel takes its name for the house, and the house in turn takes its name from the atmosphere of this local landscape. And this atmosphere is wild and harsh in the way that it stunts the trees and bends them to its will, but it's also described as pure and bracing. And so this specificity of place, which is also really highlighted by the use of the term weathering, which I think most people don't know what it means. I think it's not a widely used term and is very specifically regional, so also really tied to this sense of place. And the house too, right, is uniquely adapted to its environment. It's like built to withstand this weathering. atmosphere. But I also want to draw attention to like how fortress-like this house is. It's described as having narrow windows and jutting stones that defend it. So it's very much enclosed and fortified as opposed to this kind of wide open and wild surrounding landscape. And so I think this kind of tension between the interior and the exterior and this wildness really pervades the novel literally in these landscape descriptions, but also in terms of characterization and some of the core conflicts of the novel. So literally there's always people either trying to break out of the places that they're in or break into them. There's a very famous scene that some of you may be familiar with where a little girl ghost like actually punches through a window to try and get inside while crying, "Let me in." So it's a very dramatic example of that. But there's also kind of a metaphorical element here. This kind of sense of a conflict between the idea of freedom and passion and really kind of living wildly almost on the one hand, and then the rules of society on the other. And so, without giving too much away, one of the things that the novel asks is what happens when you grow up and kind of find yourselves constrained by new rules and social expectations. And we have to kind of navigate these choices about, that might pit kind of passion against comfort and practicality. And then we have to kind of live with the consequences of our decisions. And consequences in Wuthering Heights are always severe and long lasting. So, I think this kind of literal landscape that Emily Bronte was so immersed in really kind of maps onto a lot of these dynamics that we'll be exploring in the text as a whole.
Well, so that is such a fascinating setup. And one of the, I think, other dynamics that's very embedded in the book is this kind of tension between insiders and outsiders. And so, you have Wuthering Heights itself, which is actually a very limited cast of characters. And then you have this narration by Heathcliff, this outsider, right? Who kind of serves as a stand-in for the reader. Can you talk about that, tension between insiders and outsiders, how it shapes the text and the way that, especially as a reader, you're brought into this world?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, as you might imagine, with a novel that's so deeply embedded in a location, there's the question of what happens when people from outside, right, come into that. And yes, it's a very tight, quasi-incestuous group of characters who we are sort of following throughout the novel. Um, so yeah, there's sort of two versions of this outsider conflict that I can give examples of. One is the framing of the novel uh, through the arrival of the sort of outside narrator. There's a sort of nesting of different narrators. But this character named Lockwood arrives from the city and he's sort of looking to, get away from the hustle and bustle of city life, have a nice relaxing time on the moors. And so he is kind of like the reader in that, we're entering into this location that we don't know anything about. We don't know anything about these people. And he becomes sort of sucked into this kind of weird story of the people who have inhabited Wuthering Heights and then this neighboring estate called Thrush Cross Grange. It's always a running joke in class, but it's really hard to say Thrush Cross Grange. um, so that's sort of one outside dynamic. We as the reader and Lockwood are kind of like peering in with horrified fascination at these kind of interpersonal dynamics. But the more central outsider figure of the text, who you mentioned, is also its most famous character, Heathcliff. And it's really the like ripple effects of his arrival at Wuthering Heights that generate the action of the novel and shape the lives of really like two generations of characters. And so, Marina, if you can put up the second quote, I want to look at the moment where Heathcliff arrives as a small child to Wuthering Heights. And just for a bit of context here, Mr. Earnshaw, who's sort of the patriarch of Wuthering Heights, arrives back from a trip to Liverpool, where he has walked. He says a walk of 60 miles, so that's why he's so tired at the beginning of this passage. And this incident is narrated by one of the servants, Nelly, who was there for it. So Earnshaw says, "See here, wife, I was never so beaten with anything in my life, but you must even take it as a gift from God, though it's as dark almost as if it came from the devil." We all crowded round, and over Miss Cathy's head, I had a peep at a dirty, ragged, black-haired child, big enough both to walk and talk. Indeed, its face looked older than Catherine's. Yet, when it was set on its feet, it only stared around and repeated over and over again some gibberish that nobody could understand. I was frightened, and Mrs. Earnshaw was ready to fling it out of doors. She did fly up, asking how he could fashion to bring that gypsy brat into the house when they had their own bairns to feed and fend for, what he meant to do with it, and whether he were mad. The master tried to explain the matter, but he was really half dead with fatigue, and all that I could make out, amongst her scolding, was a tale of seeing it starving and houseless, as good as dumb, in the streets of Liverpool, where he picked it up and inquired for its owner. Not a soul knew to whom it belonged, he said, and his money and time being both limited, he thought it better to take it home with him at once than run into vain expenses there, because he was determined he would not leave it as he found it. Well, the conclusion was that my mistress grumbled herself calm, and Mr. Earnshaw told me to wash it and give it clean things and let it sleep with the children, it being Heathcliff. So, as you can see here, Heathcliff is marked as an outsider in like every possible way. He's described as dark and as a gypsy, and his racial identity is a very interesting question. It remains very ambiguous throughout the text. He's an orphan, unknown, origin and parentage, so he's kind of outside like the patrilineal structure that's very important in this culture. He's speaking gibberish, quote unquote. So there's a language divide as well. And so figuring out what to do with Heathcliff will be one of the central questions of the class. I'm certainly not going to do it in the space of this conversation. So you'll have to, sign up if you want to really delve into his character. But it's significant here that we see he's kind of brought in as an outsider, stuck right into the middle of this family. And it's his relationship with the Earnshaw family, and particularly the daughter, Cathy, and their kind of infamous romance that ends up kind of holding this whole novel together, even as Heathcliff is a very destructive force. So you end up with this really like tight, intense, insular world that's kind of like a pressure cooker that kind of tests the limits of people within it, and asks like what the effects of having this outsider person in the midst of a very traditional family structure. What are the consequences of that? And it makes for good fiction. I will say that there's never a dull moment once Heathcliff enters the picture.
And I mean, Trish, does it have messages in your view? I
Mm.
mean, is there a through line? I mean, in this is a time in literature when many of the great novels are, in some at least subtle ways, right, pushing some type of moral or other messaging.
Yeah.
What about this one? I mean, you've walked us through really interesting tension points, right, between nature and society, between insiders and outsiders. Is there a message that you think Bronte is trying to convey through the story?
No, I actually don't think so. I mean, this is the subject of endless debate, right? So, Wuthering Heights is one of the most, written about novels for a reason because it's very hard to pin down what Bronte might be saying, and what her opinion is versus what's voiced by various characters. It Yeah, so really, as you mentioned, Seth, during the Victorian period, it was very sort of widely expected that fiction would serve some kind of moral purpose. And here, Wuthering Heights is dealing with subject matter, including drinking and domestic violence, that weren't really considered proper to represent in fiction, certainly not by a woman, though Emily first published under a pen name Ellis. So initial reviewers weren't aware that it was written by a woman. And we do have some moralizing figures. Nelly, the servant who I mentioned earlier, is a great example. But as you'll see when you delve into the novel, we're not necessarily encouraged to adopt her kind of moralizing traditional viewpoints. And so I think the novel really effectively kind of holds us at a distance. And actually, just to give a sense of how potentially shocking this novel was to early Victorian readers, I pulled a couple of tidbits from reviews, if you don't mind showing that, Marina. Um, and I apologize for the harsh language in this first one, but I think it captures the strength of reactions towards this book. So, an anonymous reviewer for Graham's magazine, no relation to Graham School, as far as I know, wrote,
None.
"There's great." There's an old saying that those who eat toasted cheese at night will dream of Lucifer, as we all know. The author of Wuthering Heights has evidently eaten toasted cheese. How a human being could have attempted such a book at present without committing suicide before he had finished a dozen chapters is a mystery. It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors, such as we might suppose a person inspired by a mixture of brandy and gunpowder might write for the edification of fifth-rate blackguards. So that's one clearly offended American reviewer. And then I also include one that I think is a bit more fair in taking the novel seriously, but gets to a similar, yeah, I think sense of shock. So anonymous reviewer for the literary world, which I believe is also an American publication, wrote that it is a dark tale, darkly told, a book that seizes upon us with an iron grasp and makes us read its story of passions and wrongs, whether we will or no. Fascinated by strange magic, we read what we dislike, we become interested in characters which are most revolting to our feelings, and are made subject to the immense power of the book, a rough, shaggy, uncouth power that turns up the dark side of human nature and deals with unbridled passions and hideous inhumanities. So, if that doesn't compel you to want to read this novel, I don't know what will. But I think what these reviewers are getting at, albeit in extreme terms, are that we're really confronted with the ugly side of humanity without like a clear reason for having to see all of this, right? It's not that by reading this novel we will learn to be better people or to avoid committing some of these behaviors. I think we as a class can decide to what extent there might be, lessons to draw from the text. But I think, yeah, even the earliest readers were sort of confronted with the fact that it didn't seem to have like redeeming qualities for people looking to kind of take a message away. But like I said, I think that's one of the reasons that it warrants close study, and I think readers will, you know, be able to kind of draw whatever they want from the text, or at least venture opinions. I was reading an introduction to the novel that said, I think the first sentence was like, there are no neutral reactions to Wuthering Heights. So whether you love it or you hate it, you will feel something about it. And that's, yeah, again, that's good generation for further discussion.
Well, so I want to come to the questions that are now populating the chat. But before I do, Trish, just talk a little bit about your approach to reading this text in the class. How will you approach the classroom, the discussion? Give us insight into how you won the Outstanding Instructor Award. What do your classes look like?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. No pressure there.
Mhm.
So, in the I think the general Graham School tradition, this will be certainly a discussion-based class that takes as its starting point close readings of the text. So I see my role as both a participant and a guide as we as a class kind of work together to make meaning out of the novel. Where I think I can offer a little bit of additional instruction that will enrich our discussions, I will. So my plan is to share very brief, maybe like 5 minute um, openers with a little bit of historical context or biographical context. There will be some unfamiliar kind of terms. Again, there's some regional dialect from West Yorkshire. And so, where possible, I can serve as a translator for some of those things. But the bulk of the class, will be spent in discussion. As I mentioned, it's a text that invites strong reactions, and I want to kind of air those, and then we'll kind of investigate our feelings about the text, and then look closely at the text itself to see, why do we feel so strongly? What are the big kind of questions and problems that this text confronts us with? And then how do we kind of together make meaning and make some sense out of all of this. And based on what I know already of Graham School students, I think that that kind of collaborative exploration is where the magic is going to happen.
Wonderful. Well, very exciting. I want to get to the questions that are in the chat. The first one comes from Paulette Field. Did these reviews that you shared earlier help or hinder sales? I'll just say famously, Billy Joel came out with Only the Good Die Young. The Catholic Church put out a statement that it was dangerous to listen to. It then immediately shot up to being number one on the Billboard list, and he sent the Catholic Church the rest of all of his songs, hoping they would review those too, but it didn't happen. But that's just an N of one. But how did these reviews that committed this to being a dangerous book to read? How did those help or hinder sales?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the actual kind of numbers on this, but I do know the reception history of the book is fairly interesting because again, it was first released under the pen name. It was published at the same time as Anne Bronte's first novel and as Jane Eyre, which Jane Eyre was a smash hit. Wuthering Heights did fairly well, though not quite as well as Jane Eyre. But then shortly after Emily died, Charlotte published a second edition and revealed Emily's identity. So there's been real kind of swings in how the book was originally received. Charlotte did a lot of like trying to justify why Emily's novel was so kind of dark and twisted, and she really helped craft this image of Emily as someone who was really like unfamiliar with society and kind of like a backwater, like just untrained and uncouth, and that's why she wrote something so offensive. So Charlotte was trying to do kind of damage control, and that certainly shifted perceptions of the novel. And as the Brontes kind of gained this literary celebrity, people kind of justified or like reassessed their approach to the novel. I would be curious how kind of the sales fluctuated throughout that. But as far as I know, the sensational reviews didn't tank publication or anything like that. But I don't know that everybody was running out to buy it. I think maybe they're a little too like focused on, depressing and dark, and that wasn't quite maybe as titillating as we might think. Yeah.
Anson writes, is there a film adaptation of Wuthering Heights that is recommended by Bronte academics? I'm guessing it wasn't the last one, but
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'm actually not sure what sort of general opinion on this is, and my own project leading up to the class is to watch each of the adaptations in the order that they were released and do a bit more thinking on this. My understanding is that almost all of the adaptations eliminate the second generation of characters. So the new adaptation, I don't think is uniquely bad, and it's sort of straying from the source text. And I think again, it's almost all of them really focus on the romance between Kathy and Heathcliff, which I would argue is not really core to the text. There was an adaptation, I believe, in 2011 that was a much more small budget production that cast a black actor in Heathcliff's role, which, to my knowledge, is the only production to have a non-white person in that role. I haven't seen it yet, so I won't give a ruling on it. But my inclination is that maybe that one was doing something a bit different, and that would be interesting. But I'll know by the time class starts if if I have a definitive opinion, at least. Yeah.
John Brescher asks, do you find Wuthering's lack of moralizing similar to the intriguing lack of moralizing in so many stories in the Old Testament?
Wow, that's a fascinating question, John. It's a bit outside my own expertise. I won't venture any, scholarly opinions on the Old Testament, but um, I do think there is something very kind of Old Testament about Wuthering Heights and there's a real emphasis on, yeah, I think vengeance and, yeah, a refusal to kind of definitively draw for the reader what conclusions we should take from it. So my guess would be that in the sort of like laying it before you and leaving it to you to kind of determine what's right and wrong or whether those are the operative terms. Maybe so. I would be fascinated to know myself, actually. Yeah.
Rose Ajaz asks, were there other books that were as dark as Wuthering Heights in this time period, or was it the first of this type?
That's another great question. I think there were plenty of dark tales, certainly. I mean, one important literary genre that Wuthering Heights is kind of borrowing from or renewing is the Gothic. So there were many tales written in the late 1700s that dealt with, these were very sensationalized novels where usually there would be kidnapping, murder, centuries old, wrongdoings coming to light, people being imprisoned in towers and those sorts of things. So, we can take that as one important predecessor. I think they were a little more, this is a really broad generalization, but I think Gothic tales in general were a little more fun. They were more, intentionally exaggerated and a bit of a romp, whereas Wuthering Heights is also exaggerated, but might leave you feeling a bit more unsettled, I think. Whereas a Gothic tale, usually they sort of wrap things up pretty nicely and put a bow on it. There are certainly plenty of other kind of dark novels. I mean, we have Frankenstein is one example where there's plenty of horror elements or dark things. So I wouldn't want to put Wuthering Heights as the first, but I do think there's something unique about the world that is created, and particularly what I've been kind of harping on with this really sort of enclosed feeling environment that I think kind of lends to some of the darkness. Like you can't escape from this like really twisted group of characters and their own the sort of darkness that they are holding on to, many of them. But that's a great question.
Jennifer Lynn wants to know, how do the narrators influence the big themes and questions readers will make sense out of?
Thank you, Jennifer. Hi. That's a great question as well. So, Wuthering Heights is kind of infamously complicated in how it lays out its narrators. So we have Lockwood as sort of our surface level, and I've offered him as kind of a proxy for the reader, although he's also a bit unlikable. So we're not necessarily on his team, but he does give us this sense of like, how would a true outsider who's encountering these people in this story for the first time, what would you make of them? So I think that's a useful kind of entry point. And then within that, Nelly Dean, who I referred to a couple of times as a servant, who has been like really central to all of the action for the past two generations. She is really our primary narrator, and she's a fascinating figure that we'll discuss quite a lot in class because she both is and isn't likable, and she is definitely telling things through her own slant and perception. So the question of an unreliable narrator becomes really central to all of her presentation, and we're pretty much stuck with her for most of our accounts of what's happening. And then we also have little tidbits where we have a letter from a different character, or where we have, some scribbled diary entries. And those are other conventions of the Gothic, these kind of like layers of narrative through artifact. So you can, through the novel, piece together some different perspectives on the main events. And I think that will provide a lot of fuel for discussion because it might cast into doubt things that we thought we knew about the characters and their motivations. So yeah, I think, again, as with everything, it's complicated, but a lot of fun in terms of, yeah, all of these different layers and how we as readers are meant to kind of negotiate with and respond to these layers of narration.
So, Tricia, you mentioned that in many ways, after this comes out, the sisters say, well, our sister was really shaped by rugged experience and some of these. Anson asked, do we know if there was any real life inspiration specifically behind Wuthering Heights? Are they, for example, exaggerated biographical elements? Do you have a sense of that, either from anything we know about her or what the sisters were saying later?
Yeah, that's a really good question, one that has been, as you can imagine, many people have been curious about. So, as far as I know, there's no clear single inspiration for the story. There's a great film, a bit depressing, but a really good film um, called To Walk Invisible. It's a biopic about the Brontes during this period of life when they were writing their first three novels, basically. And they venture, and I think this is to some degree backed up by biographical evidence, that the story for Wuthering Heights was built on some sort of local um, piece of gossip, basically about a conflict within a local family in West Yorkshire, and that this narrative kind of captured Emily's attention, and she kind of expanded on it from there. There has a less reliable claim for the actual structure, the house that Wuthering Heights was based on. If you ever visit the Bronte parsonage in West Yorkshire, there is this kind of half ruined, what would not hovel is too harsh of a term, but a small stone house that's mostly fallen down on the hill. And it is very tempting to think of it as the inspiration for Wuthering Heights because it looks like so much part of the landscape. I believe those claims have been debunked, but I still think it's it's nice to think that you could actually go see the original Wuthering Heights. So yeah, I think it's a combination of multiple elements. It certainly was not based on Emily's firsthand experience. As far as we know, she had really no romantic life that has been documented. Her brother was involved in some relatively sensational an affair with a woman that Anne Bronte wrote about extensively in her novel Tenant of Wildfell Hall. So that's another potential source where at least some very severe interpersonal conflict would have entered Emily's life in that fashion.
There's another viewer here that wants to know, was there competition among the Bronte sisters? I'm guessing at some level there must have been. And from what you describe, even a need to kind of think about how each one of their reputations would affect the other.
Yeah, I mean, partly the question was very sadly kind of put to rest early on because both Emily and Anne died very
Right.
shortly after their first novels were published. And then, like I said, Charlotte really did a lot of kind of managing their reputations, and she went on to great literary celebrity. In terms of their earlier life, I think they were largely collaborative. Like as I mentioned before, they had these worlds, Angria and Gondel, like places that they had made up with a wide cast of characters, and all three of those sisters, as well as their brother Branwell, actively collaborated on creating these worlds, and they wrote little books, and so there was a general air of literary collaboration in the household. I think some tension emerged around the question of whether and how to become professional writers. So Emily was very protective of her work, did not really want it shared. And so when Charlotte, who was the most ambitious of the three, wanted to try and publish their poems, which were the first pieces of writing that they published, I think there was some conflict over Emily just not really wanting to enter into the public eye. And uh, Emily destroyed and her family have destroyed almost everything in terms of firsthand artifacts. So we have no original manuscript for Wuthering Heights. Um, Very, very little autobiographical writing. So there's a lot of mystery, right, about what the actual dynamics were, and it's mostly been left to Charlotte's account, as the one who survived the longest.
We have some specific questions about how you may approach these in the course. Will you be exploring the theory that Heathcliff was the bastard child of Catherine?
So we'll be open to
And I'm
oh,
sorry,
Catherine's
Catherine's
father. Yeah,
father.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, it would be quite hard for
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 her to
him
be
to be
inducted. Yes, I
Catherine's.
caught that after
Yeah.
finishing the question. Thank you.
Yes, I almost mentioned it when I read that quote earlier. So yeah, there have been a few literary scholars who have speculated that the novel itself kind of hints that Heathcliff might be Mr. Earnshaw's child, and I think that's a very valid interpretation. So yes, we will be looking at the text itself, right, and what those hints are and the wording that why does he care so much about this child? Liverpool was unfortunately full of, you know, orphans and people who are out on the street. So why did he feel such a vested interest in this child and need to bring it back? Those open some questions, and I think the novel leaves room certainly to interpret that. So in the class, we would of course explore like what are the implications? What if we do accept that Heathcliff is actually Mr. Earnshaw's child, how does that affect our reading of the rest of the novel? Yeah, it's a very interesting question.
Related-ish question from Judy Perlman. Why is Heathcliff considered a hero?
I mean, I think we would have to decide in the class
If
whether
he is a
he should
hero,
be.
right?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's maybe kind of an anti-hero figure, certainly. I mean, he's the name that we know from the novel, right? And why is that? He's not our narrator. He's he doesn't get more on-screen time than many of the other characters. But I think he has this sort of dark charisma maybe about him. He fits maybe some of the trope of the Byronic hero, which Charlotte Bronte in creating Mr. Rochester, that was really what she was kind of creating. And so, maybe we can read some of those qualities in Heathcliff. Um, but as to whether he's actually a hero, I'd be very interested to hear someone make that argument. And I think we probably could. But again, it's a subject for a lot of debate.
Jennifer asked, you mentioned the importance of the setting and place in general. Would you say that setting is a character on its own?
Ooh, that's a great question. I was actually just reading something that was saying that arguably Wuthering Heights and Thrush Cross Grange are the two main characters in the novel, and it's sort of what happens to the inhabitants that sort of move in and out of these spaces that drives the novel. I think that's a really great way of looking at it. I haven't thought of reading like the landscape itself as a character. I think of it almost like as a mirror. So in how characters interact with the landscape and particular elements of it tells us a lot about who they are and what their relationship to place is. There's a lot of questions about hunting and like the treatment of animals and just the level of joy that people take or don't take in the surrounding environment, and each of those I think is like heavily weighted. So when we see a character who does not want to go for a walk on the moors, we need to be a little suspicious of that character. Why don't they love the moors? So it's I think that the setting is almost like a rubric through which we then kind of read each of the different characters. Yeah, it's a great question.
Well, so we are nearing time, and as you've seen, we have a ton of questions because you have excited so many people about this. But the last one I want to ask actually comes from Sophie, and it is about you. It is about your work in prisons. If you could discuss that a little bit further, and maybe we can end, Trish, then going a little bit more broadly to why you think literature is such a powerful vehicle for people in all places in life and all stages. And so maybe we can kind of have that transition to why is literature so valuable to our lives, which I imagine is why you were bringing it in to
Yeah.
prisons as a manner of exciting and engaging people around the power of literature.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those two things are very much tied. So I basically just I did some teaching on Victorian literature inside a couple of men's prisons, and the whole point of these programs really is a just to give people who are on the inside the access to the same opportunities that those of us on the outside have. But also, there's plenty of research showing that um, education, particularly like a college education, heavily reduces the likelihood that someone would end up back in prison. And I think that just speaks to the power of education more broadly. For me, of course, it's the humanities and it's literature, but I think it's true in general. But I think that studying literature at any stage in life, absolutely, it is a call for introspection, for examining your relationship to a text and some of the big questions that it's asking. And studying literature also just it kind of trains you to pay attention and think critically. And I think those skills are always needed more in any society, right? I of course want to say, especially right now, we need it, but I think it's always true. So yeah, I think at any age, you should be reading literature, and it's best if you can read it with others in a classroom. Yeah, it's magic.
Well, thank you for bringing us into this novel and a glimpse into your class. And I will just close as one of Trish's colleagues to say it is an absolute joy to be in the room with her and to learn from her. And so we are ecstatic now that your classes will allow more of our community to do the same. And so grateful for you as a staff member here, but really excited for what you will do as an instructor. Thank you all for joining us, and hope you enjoy if you're in Chicago. What is a gorgeous day here. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
And
Thanks,
thanks,
Seth.
Trish.